Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński, welcoming you to Ukraine this week, our weekly roundup of all the major developments taking place from Kiev to Crimea, from Lviv to Donetsk. Now, in this episode, we examine the increasingly perilous security situation, with some experts warning of possible catastrophe, while the US aid package still hangs in the balance. With the vote in the US Congress scheduled to take place on Saturday, Ukraine might be on the cusp of salvation, but the path to victory remains fraught with danger. But first, let's take a look at the latest news. Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala has announced in Washington that around 20 countries have joined the Czech-led initiative to provide artillery shells for Ukraine. The Czechs, through a team of government officials and private companies, have sought at least 500,000 large-caliber munition rounds from countries around the world, with first deliveries to Ukraine expected by June.
The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has reached a critical juncture, with the country's armed forces facing unprecedented pressure. As the war enters its third year, the shortage of ammunition poses a significant challenge for Ukrainian troops defending their positions.
Lack of ammunition means that we are just holding them back in a not very effective manner because we don't have enough shells. If there were enough shells, they would not have moved that far.
But that could soon change. In Washington, Petr Fiala said around 20 states have contributed to his country's initiative to obtain much-needed ammunition for the Ukrainian army.
In 1968, I was a little boy. In 1968, I saw Russian tanks in the streets of my town. And I don't want to see this again. So we must continue to support Ukraine as long as possible. That is the reason why we started Czech Ammunition Initiative.
The Czech Republic has already contracted the delivery of 180,000 rounds, and efforts are underway to secure an additional 300,000. Russia's abundant military assets, including a substantial stockpile of ammunition. The aggressor's advantage in firepower is evident, with estimates suggesting that they could have a five-fold edge over Ukrainian forces.
After prolonged delays, the US House of Representatives is gearing up for a pivotal vote this weekend on a substantial military aid package for Ukraine and Israel, totaling tens of billions of US dollars. In the wake of Iran's recent attack on Israel, US House Speaker Mike Johnson has announced his intention to push it forward. The move comes amidst a backdrop of political discord in Congress, particularly over the inclusion of Ukraine in the aid package.
Calls for Johnson, a key ally of Republican presidential hopeful Donald Trump, to pass the bipartisan $95 billion aid package, which includes $14 billion for Israel and $60 billion for Ukraine, have come from both sides of the aisle, including the White House and leading Senate figures. The recent aggression by Iran has heightened urgency for funding, presenting Johnson with an opportunity to emphasize the need for swift legislative action.
There are precipitating events around the globe that we're all watching very carefully, and we know that the world is watching us to see how we react. We have terrorists and tyrants and terrible leaders around the world like Putin and Xi and in Iran, and they're watching to see if America will stand up for its allies and in our own interest around the globe, and we will.
With Kyiv's urgent appeals for support as Russian forces advance, the outcome of the Ukraine aid vote is particularly critical. Biden administration officials have warned that the situation in Ukraine is dire. The nation's military is running short on munitions and morale is low as the Russian army gains ground.
We need this money yesterday, not tomorrow, not today, but yesterday. We need this support, military support, yesterday, because the situation on the front line is difficult enough. We need this support from our biggest partner, from the United States.
Israel's military situation is vastly different to that of Ukraine. But Biden said that the nation's high-tech air defenses, which passed their most formidable test during last weekend's Iran missile and drone assault, need to be replenished. The cross-party support could prove to be a lifeline for Speaker Johnson, whose reliance on the minority for procedural votes marks a rare occurrence in congressional history. But as leadership on the line, the upcoming vote is not just about a foreign aid. but also a test of political resilience and strategy.
Once again this week, Russia has launched repeated drone and missile attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. Many people have been killed and close to 100 have been wounded.
Scenes like these have become a daily sight for many in Ukraine. But there is no getting used to a war. On Wednesday, Russian missiles targeted Chernihiv, a city north of Kiev, killing 18 people and wounding more than 60.
I haven't completely come to my senses yet. I haven't fully realized what happened yet. The most important thing is that my child was in the school's basement at the time. They managed to go to the shelter in time. I was worried the most about that.
This body cam footage shows the dramatic moments right after the attack. Deputies and paramedics rushed to the scene to provide medical aid to a wounded man. But despite their efforts, he died of his wounds. But Chernihiv wasn't the only target. 2 days later, Russian missiles fell on Dnipro, causing death and destruction.
The 5-story residential building was hit, the upper floor is partially destroyed, there was a fire, it was localized. As of now, there are 2 dead and 16 wounded of medium severity.
At least 8 people were killed and dozens more wounded. The locals are still trying to come to terms with what had happened.
It's horrible. You know, I've lived through most of my life without having seen something like this before.
Russian missiles fell in many other places, wreaking havoc. The most recent UN estimates say that at least 10,000 civilians have died in the conflict. But with ever-intensifying Russian attacks, that number will be only growing.
So now it is time for a military update on what's going on in Ukraine and what has been going on for the last couple of days. Now, naturally, the situation isn't changing dramatically. However, the front line is holding due to the heroism of Ukrainian troops who have been fighting for more Western aid, as well as, obviously, fending off Russian attacks. Let's take a glance now at the map, and we're going to be looking at the various regions of Ukraine. Now, here we can see the part where the Russian forces are positioned. And first, we can see Bakhmut. Now, naturally, they are trying to take Chasiv Yar, and in turn, if they manage to take that, that would open up the way towards Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Now, these names will be familiar to any one of you who might have been actually tracking the conflict even before the full-scale invasion, because even then the fighting actually reached, or was at least about to reach, those territories. Now, of course, we need to take into account the fact that the situation is very dynamic, could change at any time. Nevertheless, it is also about the Ukrainian troops fighting in the trenches using drone warfare to fend off Russian attacks. The overall situation, we might say, is still difficult. 86 combat engagements across all the Ukrainian territory during that period. Let's go now to the next region, which saw the heaviest fighting of all. However, these statistics alone will be sufficient to inspire respect for the defenders of Ukraine. Here we can see Avdiivka, the symbol of Western inaction, some could say. A town that has been holding on for a long time, but has unfortunately fallen to the Russian forces. Now, this incursion, marked in red, basically denotes the territories which are now being the subject of the fighting between Ukrainians and the Russians. And Pervomaisky and later on Umansky could actually bear the brunt of this particular attack. And overall, during the past 24 hours, as we've said, 86 combat engagements during the full-scale war, 11 missile attacks, 78 airstrikes. So this is still very much an active front line. And the dwindling resources are making it difficult for the defenders. Finally, let's take a glance at the overall situation here. So we can see Ukraine, actually we're zooming in towards Kupiansk right now. Again, a very important territory, very important part of Ukraine. This territory actually saw no major assault missions from the enemy. Still, With no intelligence information available to us, we do not really know what the enemy might be planning. We know that the front line has been described as fragile by some experts. There is a risk of collapse at some point. On the other hand, we know that initiatives to deliver ammunition, especially artillery munitions, are now underway. The final glance at Ukraine shows us the entire territory. It is important because apart from the obvious regions which have seen heavy fighting, there is also Crimea, illegally occupied by Russia, and we absolutely need to remind you about the major ATACMS strike, which has eliminated tons of Russian equipment there in a Russian airbase, with estimated losses being in the region of $1 billion, possibly a few S-400 anti-aircraft systems lost in that attack. This might actually have been a major setback for the Russians, but also a sign that Ukrainians are still fighting back as long as they have the weapons at their disposal. And now we're going to take a short break, but please stay with us here on Ukraine this week, as there are more interesting features coming up today. And now it's time to take a glance at the situation from a journalist's perspective. And for that, we're joined by OSKI, our TVP World correspondent in Kiev. Hello, Oz. Good to hear from you again. Good to see you, actually. And we're going to be examining the situation as it unfolded during these last few hours. Now, what can you tell us about the recent attacks? We know that there have been civilian casualties once again, and we've seen some dramatic footage there. So can you run us through the most recent events taking place in Ukraine?
Yeah, there have been attacks across at least 5 regions of Ukraine. That's in the last 24 hours, killing at least 7 people and injuring 34 others, but that could be expected to rise.
So that's always the unfortunate truth of war. The casualty figures are never accurate until a long time after the event, right? So these situations are theoretically nothing new, but do you think that the Western public opinion is unfortunately growing somewhat accustomed to it? I mean, we were all focusing on the Middle East recently, on the exchange of fire between Israel and Iran without any casualties. It was spectacular, but it was more of a demonstration of force. Meanwhile, civilians still dying in Ukraine. So do you think that the Western media are making one of the biggest mistakes, essentially, just becoming desensitized to the images of violence?
Look, I think that is a problem, but I don't think it's a problem unique to Ukraine. I would argue that that's a situation that's similarly repeated in Gaza, in Sudan, particularly at the moment, and Syria before that. I think that the drip of this number of people dead today and this number of people dead today, people start to normalize that, and I do think that is a problem. It's really difficult to discuss ways to kind of address that in the media, because I'm on the air every night reporting these facts, and many other reporters are doing the same. It's just that it's just not having as much traction, which I think is a different thing to the media not covering it. There's an argument potentially about how much space is given to these things, how far up the news agenda something goes, but there's no way to get that balance perfect with what's happening all across the world right now. All we can do really as reporters is try our best to report what's happening and how it's impacting people's lives particularly.
And that is an excellent point. So one final question. Now, when looking at the Ukrainian public opinion, is there a general sense of expectation when it comes to the upcoming vote in the US Congress? Now, but we're basically looking at it from the perspective of the moment when we're recording this program. So by the time some of our viewers are watching this vote may actually have already happened. So we don't know the result. But what is the mood in Ukraine right now? Are Ukrainians really waiting for this US aid, which has been blocked for so long due to political bickering in the US Congress?
So look, I think the expectation's not the right word. There's an exasperation here in Ukraine, given how long it's taken for this aid to this was supposed to be sorted out in the autumn, and now we're in the spring, and lots of Ukrainians have died as a result of this bickering, as you call it. So I believe the vote is going to go forward to the House floor later on, and we're expecting that it's going to pass comfortably, given the size of the vote for the resolution to bring the vote to the floor. So yeah, this is expected to go through, but I think the feeling here in Ukraine is that this should have been sorted out in autumn. So exasperation and worry. People are afraid about bad news coming from the front lines. Their friends, their compatriots, their brothers, their sisters dying every single day because the US continues to prevaricate on aid.
So there is a sense of anxiety, and it shouldn't surprise us really, because there are so many tragic human stories beyond the simple fact that really this discussion on aid delivery a couple of months ago, we would have thought nothing like that should ever happen. And the fact that we're actually discussing this today after so many months of waiting, well, it is a tragedy in itself, one could say, for the political system at least. OSKI from Kyiv, thank you very much for giving us this update. And as always, stay safe.
Thank you, Jonasz.
In a sobering assessment, General Sir Richard Barrons, the former commander of the UK's Joint Forces Command, has expressed concerns about Ukraine's ability to continue its defense against Russian aggression. He says there is, and I quote, a serious risk that Ukraine could face defeat in 2024, citing dwindling resources and a potential loss of morale as key factors. While by no means the only possible conclusion of the war, this is just one in a series of warnings intended to galvanize the West into action.
Ukraine's military, hailed for its resilience, is now critically low on ammunition, troops and air defense. Despite a significant counter-offensive by Ukraine last year, Russian forces have remained entrenched on seized ground.
The situation at the front during such a hot war is always difficult, but these days, and especially on the Donetsk directions, it's getting harder. I thank every brigade, every soldier and commander who do everything to defend our positions and destroy the occupier.
Sir Richard Barnes highlighted Russia's current strategy of overwhelming Ukrainian defenses with 5-to-1 advantage in artillery and manpower, bolstering by the deployment of new weapons like the aircraft FAB glide bomb.
And we should always recognise that Russia is so much bigger than Ukraine, that the more time passes, the more you would expect Russia to learn and Russia to do better. And we're beginning to see some signs of that.
The anticipation of a major Russian offensive this summer raises the specter of a breakthrough that could overrun Ukrainian positions. Last year's intelligence on Ukraine's likely attack vectors allowed Russia to blunt advances toward the Sea of Azov. Now, the uncertainty of Russia's next move looms large, with several potential targets. Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, which is near the Russian border, is under constant missile attacks. The Donbas region, embroiled in conflict since 2014 and partially illegally annexed by Russia in 2022, continues to be a focal point of intense fighting. The loss of key towns like Bakhmut and Avdiivka, along with heavy casualties, underscores the dire situation. Zaporizhia, a strategic city still under Ukrainian control despite being in a region claimed by Russia, represents another critical juncture. Its fall would not only be a symbolic victory for Moscow, but also a strategic one, given the proximity to the front lines. Ukraine, however, is not given up. Army engineers are working around the clock to build defensive fortifications along the front line and the border with Russia.
Behind me is an anti-tank trench, preventing the enemy hardware from moving forward. It is part of a system of obstacles and barriers, mines, as well as non-explosive obstructions, such as, for instance, pyramids and others. All there will be mined, part of the whole system of defense.
As the conflict enters a critical phase, Ukraine has allocated more than $500 million this year to fortify both the border and the front line across its east and south. With Russian troops pushing hard in the east and vital US military aid held up months of Republican resistance in Congress, the urgency has been growing.
And joining us now is Yevgenia Kravchuk, Ukrainian MP and Deputy Chair at the Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policy in Ukraine. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So let's begin with the political turmoil surrounding Ukraine aid. Naturally, we're in an awkward position because we're recording this program before the crucial vote actually is scheduled to happen in the US Congress. So major developments could be just around the corner. What is your take on all this, on this journey, which may actually come to a successful conclusion unless something unexpected happens? But this has taken a very, very long time. Do you feel disappointed that the biggest, most powerful democracy in the world has actually taken so long to get this going?
I had so many conversations with American politicians about the speed of the aid, and one of them said, you know, we're Americans. We will try anything else until we get the right choice. So I hope the right choice is coming right now as we speak and as our viewers are watching this interview. And I think, of course, it's belated. Of course, we could avoid the loss of many lives, but still it's a clear signal, could be a clear signal to this new evil acts that democracy will not just give up so easily. And of course, sometimes I feel that the whole Ukraine and the Ukrainians are living in the reality show when other countries are watching through the glass how we behave, how we can handle it. The director of CIA clearly said that 2024 could be a crucial year, but also all the intelligence services of different countries in 2022 said that Ukraine will not last longer than 2 weeks and Russia will be in Kyiv by that time.
That is an excellent point indeed, and there are commentators and politicians which are trying to tone down this overall feeling of perhaps not panic, but of concern which is being voiced by some. I mean, quite recently Poland's foreign minister has said that we shouldn't really focus on the worst case scenario because despite the problems, Ukraine also has a massive potential and it could win this war, but we as the West, the collective West, need to step up our efforts. Right? So looking at this now, what do you think is the biggest danger for Ukraine at this stage in political terms, not in military terms, because we know that this is something very difficult to predict, but in terms of the political side of things, what would you say is the biggest menace at this stage?
Well, I don't know what you mean, from the inside or from the outside, what political manners you would mean, because there are a lot of elections in 2024. There are elections to European Parliament, and there is, I would say, a hazard of far right who do not favor the help, the aid to Ukraine, could gain more seats, but are still quite optimistic that we will have the pro-Ukrainian and pro-democratic, pro-European majority in European Parliament. Yeah, but of course, it's quite tough sometimes inside of Ukraine. We just passed a very complicated, very difficult bill about mobilization. We got the 283 votes, which is close to constitutional majority. But still, there are some political speculations on that. But we do take a difficult decision because we understand what is on stake, and we hope that our partners in the West that live in far more comfortable conditions could take difficult decisions, sometimes not favored by the public, by spending more money for something outside of the country, but that will save their country from Russian troops inside of it.
And that was a very good point that you've made about the European elections, but also individual elections in European Union member states. I mean, we already had Viktor Orban, who unfortunately is still up to no good. I mean, in a most recent statement, he called Ukraine a protectorate of the West, implying that Ukraine is no longer sovereign. I mean, statements like that are really infuriating, from my perspective, because I know them to be completely false, as do you. But also we have Robert Fico, Slovakia. So we have, once again, countries which are backsliding, right? They are actually taking, if not Russia's side, then at least they are not helping. Do you think that this is the biggest problem that we're facing, that our voters do not appreciate the Russian threat?
I did mention about the comfortable conditions where countries are living at, and that's for a reason. And can you imagine another European country holding up for so long, for more than 2 years, with hundreds of thousands of troops into the area? And for example, since the January of 2024, Russia had fired more than 1,000 of missiles and more than 2,800 of drones on Ukrainian territory. Can you imagine another country in Europe that can take so much and actually, operate, have fully operational government, president, parliament, and actually parliament that is at the same time voting for the European integration legislation and doing all of the long list that European Commission sent us from Brussels. So I think it's we are sort of a wall that protects other countries from Russian invasion, and we hope that people will understand that that's why they live a normal life right now.
One final question. Are you concerned that behind closed doors, the most powerful nations, global leaders, are actually debating some sort of conclusion to the war, which would be intended as a compromise, not realizing that this is not a time for compromise? I've recently read an article which suggested that the war may end up with Ukraine being essentially told, look, you need to give up the territories you lost, but the ones that you hold on to, which are under your control, are going to be a part of NATO and the EU. So, from the perspective of some leaders, it could sound like a good deal, but they forget about the war crimes, about the fate of people in those territories, Crimea, the Donbass. Do you think there is a risk that Western leaders will ignore the plight of ordinary Ukrainians and just, rubber stamp some sort of deal which they considered to be a good one, without realizing it's going to be a tragic and unjust ending to this conflict?
Well, sometimes I think that it would be easier for many countries if we give up, but we won't. And it's not just about Ukraine, because it's about the rules in the world. So if Russia is permitted to take someone's, in our case, Ukrainian territory, what are the rules in the world will prevent China of not doing it with Taiwan, of North Korea attacking South Korea, of any disruptions in the Middle East, because actually they are connected to what's going on in Ukraine, because actually Iran is an ally of Russia. So we're talking about much bigger conflict, if I may say, because it's very hard for me to say world conflict because it's a full-scale aggression, but it's about bigger than just a regional loss of a few towns somewhere in Donbass region. It's about the world order.
Precisely, and this is something that some leaders are still reluctant to recognize, even at this stage. Yevgenia Kravchuk was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight. Germany has committed to supplying Ukraine with an additional US-made Patriot air defense system, along with missiles for existing systems. President Volodymyr Zelensky announced the aid as the nation continues to face relentless Russian airstrikes against its energy infrastructure.
With the war surpassing the 2-year mark, Russia's intensified its assault on power station, leading to urgent requests from Kyiv for advanced air defenses. These are the remains of Trypillia power station, one of the largest providing electricity to Kyiv. This week, Russian missiles destroyed it completely.
We ran out of all missiles to defend Trypillia. When someone says that our allies cannot provide us with this or that weapon, or they cannot be in Ukraine with this or that force, because that would be perceived as if Ukraine is engaging NATO in the war. Well, after yesterday's attack, I want to ask you a question. Is Israel part of NATO or not? Here is the answer. Israel is not a NATO country. The NATO allies, including NATO countries, have been defending Israel. They showed the Iranian forces that Israel was not alone, and this is a lesson. This is a response to anyone on any continent who said you need to assist Ukraine very carefully so you don't engage NATO countries in the war.
To address the crisis swiftly, Germany is spearheading an initiative to provide Ukraine with 7 more Patriot batteries, a weapon that has already proved useful in countering Russian attacks.
NATO has made it very clear that of the systems that are available in the NATO states, several could make a decision like ours to hand over another system so that better protection is possible against the many attacks currently happening against Ukraine. And I would like to take this opportunity to emphasize this appeal once again.
Earlier this month, Berlin committed to supplying Ukraine with an additional Patriot air defense system from its own stocks. President Zelensky has stressed that Ukraine needed a total of 25 Patriots to protect the entire country. For now, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba hopes to secure 7 systems to protect Ukraine's largest cities.
This war cannot and must not be normalized. Ukrainian air defense is now protecting not only Ukrainian skies from Russian air terror. It also shields neighboring Moldova, Romania and Poland from the immediate threat of missile and drone entering their airspace.
As preparations for June's Ukraine Reconstruction Conference in Berlin continue, Scholz and Zelensky have vowed to maintain intensive cooperation, underscoring the solidarity between Germany and Ukraine during these challenging times.
And joining us now is John Sweet, retired U.S. Army intelligence officer. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thanks for having me back on the show.
So let's begin with a hypothetical situation. The front lines, if not collapsing, then at least are moving in the wrong direction. Russia is gaining initiative, and Western countries see that things are not going well. Do you still think that Western nations, whether under the NATO umbrella or individually as a sort of coalition of the willing, could intervene in some way? Because there is a utter discrepancy when it comes to this particular option. Some countries are saying it's a possibility, others are saying no way. So what do you think is the most likely solution here?
Well, I certainly think it's a possibility. The French president has already told us that it's a possibility for French to commit forces should there be a significant breakthrough by Russian forces that would threaten the capital city of Kyiv. So it's possible. I think it's obviously in the best interest of obviously NATO and the United States to continue funding and supporting the war, and we're seeing that right now. We have 7 NATO nations, the European nations, that have signed security agreements, and Poland and Romania are also in a process of signing security agreements to bilateral security agreements. And we have the funding, hopefully, within the United States that's going to go through or at least be voted on here shortly of the $60 billion. So it's the sense of urgency certainly exists.
So, of course, even if we actually have approval on all these deals, it is going to take time to deliver that. Like the Czech initiative, the shells will be there, but they will be there in June. So right now we have the most fragile, unstable period on the front lines. However, we're not really seeing any sort of massive apocalyptic push from the Russian side. They are, of course, pushing forward, trying to take more villages and small towns. But they are, just as General Ben-Hodges recently described this in an interview, they are oozing in. Why do you think that is? Do you think that the Russian army is being overrated once again? Because we're saying that it could win in Ukraine, but they might actually have this huge window of opportunity right now because Ukraine is starved for ammunition, for equipment, and yet, apart from these tragic attacks against civilians and this gradual push, nothing else is happening. Why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, in the close fight, and that's the fight there in the trenches, the Ukrainian military is decimating Russian forces as they advance. And yes, they are advancing, and yes, they are gaining some terrain. But the mobile defense that the Ukrainian military has put in place has been very effective. At least according to British intelligence, we're seeing upwards of 750 to 1,000 Russians being killed a day. Now, the other issue is it gets to the point that you just made. Have we once again overrated the Russian military? And the answer is probably yes. What we're seeing are limited assaults, and what we're seeing, in a sense, are human waves. We're seeing assault that gets turned back, followed on by another assault, followed on by another assault, and they gradually are taking terrain. But the best and the brightest, the most elite forces within the Russian army have been decimated. What we're seeing now are the conscripts, the cannon fodder, the soldiers that are being told to advance, and there's no turning back because of the barrier troops that are behind them won't let them turn back. So
it's a Soviet strategy, in other words, right? But we're also seeing, unfortunately, these glide bombs. The FAB 1500 and an even heavier version is being planned right now, being dropped on the civilian population of Ukraine. It seems we're so painfully close to be able to deter these attacks. But we're just, once again coming back to the lack of air defenses, the pace at which, some of the equipment was being drip-fed to Ukraine. They still don't have the F-16s. They're still on their way. Do you think that we're actually losing the perfect opportunity to get rid of this threat from this part of Europe once and for all?
I think we are missing opportunities. And here's what I think about the air defense system, okay? And I've said this repeatedly. Mark Toff and I have in multiple publications. Air defense is a necessity. It's something that we need to have. It's something that Ukraine must have in order to protect their infrastructure. Shooting down the missile in flight is critical. But shooting down the missile in flight does nothing to the weapon system itself. So it enables the weapon system to fire again and again and again. What Ukraine is missing, in addition to air defense, is the weapon systems that can affect those missile systems, okay, where they are. And they're not firing from within Ukraine, they're firing from within Russia, they're firing from within the Black Sea, they're firing from within Crimea. So what they need are precision deep strike weapons. They need the U.S. ATACMS. They need the German Taurus. They need fighter jets. They need Shadow and the Scout missiles to affect that. And also, what they have to affect is what we call the interdiction fight, okay? They're winning the close fight, but they're losing the interdiction. If you cannot stop the Russian forces and their equipment from entering the country, you are going to fight the close fight every day. They're not creating space for their military to operate. What they're doing is forcing the military to fight a defensive fight. And you're absolutely correct. The lag time from purchase to weapon system or ammunition getting on the ground is significant, and it is affecting the outcomes of battles on the ground right now.
So how effective do you think Ukrainians will be with their attempts to plug this gap by using drone technology? Recent reports indicate they might already be putting into production a type of drone that has a 3,000-kilometer range. Now that, in theory, could even reach the biggest tank factory in all of Russia, Nizhny Tagil. That's the biggest manufacturing plant that they have. Do you think that this is a solution that could actually turn the tides, or is it merely the sort of thing that will be painful to the Russians? Perhaps a few more refineries will go up in flames, but will not be the perfect replacement for all these missing systems that the West could provide, but they are still not doing so.
Right. Look, it's a piece of the puzzle, okay? That is the deep fight. That is affecting Russia's ability to wage war. That is affecting their ability to make weapons. That is affecting their ability to generate revenue to fund the war. That's part of the fight. But right now, Ukraine must stop the bleeding. And the bleeding is within the trenches, and the bleeding is within the war of interdiction and the vulnerability that they have right now to open skies and their inability to engage missiles as they're following, and their inability to engage the weapon system itself. But they're all interconnected. It's a multi-domain fight. It's it's close, deep, rear is the strategy, and right now they're fighting close, and they're unable to do the other two.
One quick question then, just to round it up. The most recent military losses that Russia has sustained, which ones do you think are the most likely to be acutely felt by the Russian military?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, from my position, it's going to be mass. And when I say mass, it's mass in terms of personnel. But Russia can regenerate their combat power through conscription. But the loss of certain types of equipment, particularly Russia, is heavily dependent upon artillery. If you take Russia's ability to hit you with artillery, you significantly remove one of their biggest killers on the battlefield. So artillery is critical. And Ukraine was very effective in counter battery attacks upwards to 6 to 8 months ago, and it's fallen off some. So in order to affect the battle, you have to take out that particular piece of warfare, and that's artillery and their ability to mass it.
So clearly, the West should appreciate the fact that Ukrainians are adept at learning new methods of fighting and at taking out the enemy equipment, provided that they have their equipment and resources of their own to actually stay in the fight. John Sweet was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And that's all on this edition of Ukraine This Week. Please stay with us here on TVP World, and we'll be back in a week's time.